Welcome back to American Old West Tales. In today's video, we will be talking about the West Point goats of the Civil War. The term goat has a special spot in the tradition of the U.S. Army, and during the Civil War there were quite a few West Point goats. You see, this here term is used to talk about the cadet who graduates from West Point Military Academy with the lowest grade point average, GPA, or as they put it in the 1909 Howitzer Yearbook, the man who would have stood first if he had boned, meaning if he had studied harder. Now don't go thinking it's a badge of shame. No, sire. It's more about recognizing the kind of grit or maybe foolhardiness it takes to be the last graduate from the cream of the crop. You see, back in them days before they made changes in the 70s, the order of graduation was all based on how you ranked in your class. So everyone knew that the last fella to get his diploma was the class goat. And because they ranked low, these goats usually ended up in the infantry or cavalry branches, the very ones most likely to see combat and lead their troops right into harm's way. Nowadays, they keep the class rank a tight-lipped secret, but somehow, the graduating bunch always finds out before the big ceremony. And when that goat gets his diploma, the whole class raises a ruckus with cheers and even hands him a shiny silver dollar. Now, everybody who's taken a lick of American history knows the names like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, J. Stewart, William Tecumseh Sherman, Ulysses S. Grant, and Philip Sheridan, and they know all about their doings during the Civil War. But what about them West Point failures who became Civil War generals? What kind of mark did they make on history? But before we explore that, please subscribe our channel and like the video. West Point's first goat, a fella by the name of John Taylor Pratt from the class of 1818, didn't find himself in the midst of the Civil War action. You see, Pratt didn't get his officer's commission due to all them political squabbles, so he moseyed on back to Kentucky and made himself a living as a merchant and even served as a state senator. Now, when the Civil War came knocking, Pratt, despite his years, offered to lend a hand, but them Confederate forces, they kindly turned him down. Guess they figured he was better suited for merchanting and politicking than for battle. West Point's second goat was Albert Gallatin Edwards, a fella from the class of 1832 over at West Point. Well, he wasn't much for book learning, but he sure had a knack for making money. After he got his diploma, Edwards ended up posted near St. Louis, Missouri, riding with the mounted rangers and dragoons. But before long, he hung up his spurs after tying the knot with Louise Caban, and he turned his hand to merchantin, and even took on the role of bank commissioner. Now, even though he didn't get in on the action, President Lincoln saw something in him and made him Brigadier General of the Missouri Volunteers. And then, lo and behold, Lincoln called on him to be the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. But it didn't stop there, no sire. When Edwards was a ripe 75 years old in 1887, he went and founded his very own brokerage firm, A.G. Edwards and Son Stock and Bond Traders. So while he might not have been much of a scholar, Edwards sure knew how to make a dollar or two. Next in the list is the goat who met his fate on the way to battle. Hugh McLeod, a fella from the class of 1835 over at West Point, was a Confederate through and through. McLeod, he didn't stick around long after graduating. Nope, he hightailed it out of there to join the fight for Texas independence. He spent his time out on the frontier, locking horns with Native Americans. Now McLeod, he didn't shy away from the thick of it. He even led the 1841 Santa Fe expedition as a brigadier general, but them Mexicans, they caught him and took him captive. They let him loose in 1842, though. Back in Texas, he wore a couple of hats, serving as Inspector General and taking a seat in the Texas House of Representatives. But when the Civil War came knocking, he got himself appointed as a colonel of the 1st Texas Infantry Regiment. Sadly, he never made it to General Robert E. Lee's side. Pneumonia got the better of him in Virginia while he was heading there. It's a tale of a man who fought on many fronts, but the final battle took him en route to join General Lee, the goat who embodied the true spirit of the term. William Logan Crittenden, a fella from the class of 1845 at West Point, well, he may have left this world before the Civil War, but his courage and mettle make him the very definition of a goat. Right after he got that diploma, he fought like a true hero in the Mexican-American War. But Crittenden, he was a man of action. And in 1851, he gave up his officer's commission to join a mission to liberate Cuba from the clutches of Spain. He threw his lot in with the Narciso Lopez expedition. Now things didn't go as planned, and he and his men got separated from the main force. Left with no choice, they took control of 4 small fishing boats, but fate had other ideas. The Spanish warship Habanero nabbed them, and they were shipped back to Havana, where they faced charges of piracy and were condemned to meet their maker by a firing squad. Now, when the time came for their execution, they were brought out in groups of 10. The commander of the firing squad, he had a peculiar demand. He wanted Crittenden to order his men to turn their backs to the squad and kneel. But Crittenden, he spoke plain and clear, saying, "Kentuckian turns his back on no man and kneels only to God." And with that, the firing squad carried out the sentence on August 16, 1851. It's a tale of a man who stood tall in the face of death and lived up to the true meaning of the word goat. The gutsiest goat who rode into the pages of history. George Edward Pickett, a man from the class of 1846 over at West Point, might have been appointed from the land of Illinois, but he'd go on to become one of the most renowned Virginians in history. Funny how life works sometimes. Now Pickett, he was a well-liked cadet, but he was more known for his courage than his book smarts. Brigadier General William M. Gardner, he had this to say about him: "A man of ability, but belonging to a cadet set that appeared to have no ambition for class standing and wanted to do only enough study to secure their graduation. In plain terms, he was a fella who didn't care much for his class rankings, but had a whole heap of bravery in him. He showed that bravery in spades when he faced the enemy during the Mexican War and tussled with them Indians up in the Pacific Northwest. And then, when the Civil War came a-knockin', Pickett was right there in the thick of it, leading his men at the Second Battle of Petersburg, Gettysburg, and Appomattox. But it was that fateful day at the Battle of Gettysburg when he led his men in a charge that would go down in history as Pickett's charge. It didn't end well, and many brave souls were lost. After the war between the states, Pickett figured he might face a court-martial, so he and his kinfolk hightailed it to Canada. They stayed there till 1866, but then they returned to Virginia, and Pickett took up a new line of work as an insurance agent and farmer over in Norfolk. Now, folks say that the loss of his men haunted him till the day he passed on in 1875. His widow, LaSalle, she had a knack for telling a good yarn, and she liked to spin a tale about young Pickett meeting Congressman Abe Lincoln and sharing his dreams of being a soldier. But that tale didn't hold water, 'cause Pickett had already graduated by the time Congressman Lincoln was in office. Guess even the bravest goats like to embellish their stories from time to time. The Harry goat from West Point's herd. Henry Harry Heath, a member of the class of 1847 over at West Point, was a Confederate through and through. Right from day one at the academy, he didn't take things too seriously and managed to rack up a couple of demerits for laughing in ranks in morning parade. He didn't much care for his class rank, see. For Harry, his time at West Point was more about having a good time. There's a story from the summer of 1844 when he was giving a hard time to a plebe. That's a first-year cadet. He kept at it until that plebe had enough and chucked his rifle right at Harry. Well, that rifle went and stuck right in Harry's thigh, nearly missing his femoral artery. When the Civil War came round, Harry didn't shy away from the fight. He was in the thick of it at the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Siege of Petersburg. Heck, he even led a whole division at Gettysburg, and some folks blame him for starting the whole shebang by sending his men into town before the rest of the army was ready. But Harry, he didn't stop there. After the American Civil War, he took on the Plains Indian War, and one of the most notable dust-ups was the Battle of Ash Hollow against the Lakota. He even wrote the first U.S. Army marksmanship manual. A goat who met his fate. Far from home. James McQueen McIntosh, a man from the class of 1849 over at West Point, had a lineage that went all the way back to England's Jacobite uprising in 1715. Most of his kinfolks made their way to these American shores in 1739. Now his PA, he passed on during the Mexican-American War over at Molino del Rey. But James, he was the first in his family to get himself a military education. Funny thing about James, though, he had this notion that once he was tested on something, he didn't need that knowledge no more. They called it a spec and dump over at West Point, and it's a term that's still used today. James, he kicked off his military career as a Federalist, but his mind changed in a hurry when he was posted at Fort Smith, Arkansas. He up and resigned his commission, and as he was making his way to Atlanta, Georgia, He crossed paths with Solon Borland, who was the father of Harold Borland. Now, Harold had raised himself a whole cavalry brigade, and they were marching on Fort Smith. Well, James, he didn't waste no time and volunteered to play a big role in organizing a Confederate force for the frontier. They made him a major in the Confederate Army, and he worked his way up to be the colonel of the 2nd Arkansas Mounted Rifles. Now, James, he served with honor and distinction, but he missed out on all them big battles of the Civil War. It was at the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas on March 7, 1862, when he met his end. A West Point goat who pledged never to give in, Lawrence Simmons Baker, a man from the class of 1851 over at West Point, well, he was cut from a different cloth. Right after he tossed that cap in the air, he was posted with the Mounted Rifles and sent out to the frontier, roam in around Kansas, Dakota Territory, Texas, and New Mexico. But when the rumblings of the Civil War started, Baker threw in his lot with the Confederate Army in 1861, and would you believe it, within a year, he was in command of the 1st North Carolina. Now here's where things get mighty interesting. Baker and Custer, they both found themselves in a bit of a scrap near Rummel Farm during the First Battle of Gettysburg. Them two forces went at each other hammer and tongs, sabers flashing and all, but Custer and Baker, they didn't cross paths themselves. Somehow they both came out of that brawl in one piece, even though Custer lost a good 219 of his men from his brigade. But the war, it wasn't done with Baker yet. On July 31, 1863, he lost his right arm, and that left him permanently changed. They sent him back to North Carolina, and he was given the task of organizing the defense of the state. Now, come April 12, 1865, Baker got orders to join up with General Joseph E. Johnston near Raleigh, North Carolina. But on April 13, 1865, he heard the news that General Lee had surrendered on April 9, 1865, and the Army of Northern Virginia had been paroled. But Baker, he couldn't accept that the war was over, and he couldn't bring himself to surrender. So he and his men, they kept on riding, evading capture until April 18, 1865, when they found out that Johnston had surrendered too. Baker, he didn't waver, and he didn't bow his head in shame. He rode on home, his honor untarnished and his spirit unbroken. Well, let's ponder this. How many pieces does a 12-pound artillery shell break into? Harold Borland, a man from the class of 1860 over at West Point, he and George W. Vanderbilt of New York, they were in a real horse race to the bottom, you might say. Now there's a tale that goes something like this. During an exam, they asked Borland a right puzzling question. How many pieces does a 12-pound shell burst into? Well, Harold, he took his sweet time thinking it over, and when he finally spoke up, all he said was, more than 2. Now that right there got a rousing cheer from his fellow graduates when he walked back to his seat. Now they put Borland with the Mounted Rifles at first, but he had other plans. He up and resigned to join the Confederate Army as an infantryman. He ended up working as the assistant adjutant on General Slaughter's staff. It was in those days that he found himself captured aboard the Alice Vivian, a ship that was trying to slip through the Mobile Havana blockade. They took him and locked him up in a prison in Boston Harbor, where he stayed for a little over a year. But come October 1, 1864, he was exchanged for Major Forbes from Boston. After the war, he changed his tune and became a federal tax collector. The real grit of this goat shone bright at Chancellorsville. Charles Nelson Warner, a fella from the class of 1862 over at West Point, well, he had a bit of a rocky start. Back in 1861, they sent him packing to Pennsylvania because he couldn't quite pass an exam, partly because of a prank played by Cadet George Custer of all folks. But when the Civil War came a-knockin', he got himself another chance. Now, mind you, he struggled something fierce with his studies, but he pushed through and graduated with the class of 1862, although they called him the Goat. Now he's a rare kind of goat because he got himself a shot to serve with the artillery. See, Warner, he had a hankering for the artillery corps, reckoning it was easier work than the infantry or cavalry. They made him a second lieutenant with the 2nd Artillery Regiment. His first taste of the battlefield was at the Battle of Antietam, but it was at Chancellorsville where he really made his mark. There, he led a stand that saved the hides of many a Union soldier that day. He stuck with the Union for 8 long years before calling it quits and moseying on to become a lawyer. The West Point goat who stuck around the longest, Charles A. Dempsey, a fella from the class of 1865 over at West Point, well, he hailed from Virginia but threw his lot in with the Union. Now that class of '65, they were itching for a good fight. But wouldn't you know it, General Robert E. Lee up and surrendered just a few weeks before their graduation. Dempsey, they commissioned him into the 17th Infantry and shipped him off to Texas. Life out there on the frontier, it was a tough one, and run-ins with the Native Americans, well, they were few and far between. So, the promotions, they came mighty slow. It took Dempsey a whopping 23 years to climb up to captain, and then he had to wait another 10 long years to become a major. But come 1898, he got himself mixed up in the San Juan campaign down in Cuba, and for his trouble, they pinned a silver star on him. When the Spanish-American War broke out, they hoisted him up to the rank of lieutenant colonel. But eventually, in 1901, after a grand total of 36 years, he hung up his boots and retired from active duty. Now here's where it gets real interesting. In 1914, they called him back to the colors for World War I, and he served once more. But by 1918, he was back in retirement, this time with the rank of brigadier general. Dempsey, he passed on in Richmond on June 4, 1941, right on the eve of World War II, after a total of 46 years in the saddle.